I'd like to call our first speaker, who's Roger McKenzie. And Roger is probably someone whom you all know, but he's been working at UNISON now for a number of years, and is, sorry, I'm just getting my things ready. So he is Assistant General Secretary for UNISON, that's the Public Services Union. He's responsible for organizing and recruitment, as well as activist and member education. He's held this post since December 2010, so he's someone who certainly has a lot of expertise in the area. Prior to that, he was West Midlands Regional Secretary of UNISON. And before that, he was he was Midlands Regional Secretary of the TUC. He's the first Black person to hold his current and his two previous posts. So I think in many ways, someone right at the forefront of the issue of racism in the workplace. And I'd like to call Roger to come in. Roger's going to talk specifically about institutional racism and the workplace. And he's going to look at issues around COVID and the disproportionate impact that it has specifically on migrant workers. So thank you, Roger. Can you come in now?
Well, thanks, Sonia. Hello. Hi there. And it's good to see all the other panelists as well, and that so many people are joining this call on a Tuesday afternoon. It's really, really important issue that actually moves beyond hashtags and beyond little explanations about how people are against racism and how people really don't see colour, apparently, or how they, their best friend or cousin or somebody might be Black. This is a really serious issue that for many of us is literally a matter of life and death. And it's not something that's just about what goes on in the United States, because you have these conversations with people lately and they tend to talk first of all about George Floyd, and they don't, as important as that was, they don't talk about the issues that are facing Black workers in this country at this moment in time, and frankly issues that have faced us for so long now, things that really need to be sorted out. And that's really what I want to talk about a little bit, some of the things that are facing us at the moment as Black workers, where many of our community are just scared to leave the house at the moment, scared to go and into, just out in the streets, scared to go into their workplaces, scared to take the vaccine that might save their lives, because so many people see that surrounded by so many other things about the attitude of this government to Black people, where we have a prime minister that thinks it's all right to call us pickaninnies, for example, where you have a prime minister that thinks it's all right to insult Muslim women, and then we're supposed to have some trust towards that prime minister. At a time when Black people are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And no one's done anything about that. No one's told us really what is going on. And yet people are supposed to take on trust that this government is prepared to do something about it. Well, the real context is this, is that we have faced discrimination in workplaces, both institutional racism, but also direct racism in workplaces for as long as I can remember. I first went into, I started my working life in 1979, and you're probably thinking, you don't possibly look that old, Roger, but sadly I am. And back in 1979, when I left school, literally weeks after Thatcher was elected as Prime Minister, and all the time, that's been framed by people who think it's all right to treat Black people as if we're something they've scraped off the bottom of their shoe when we go into workplaces. We have to still consider whether it's safe to go into some workplaces, physically safe, but also whether we're going to get treated properly within those workplaces. These are long-standing issues, but these have been exacerbated by what we are facing now in the workplace around COVID-19. Thousands and thousands of Black workers feel that they're in danger at this minute in time. And I'll tell you one of the most moving things that's happened to me over the last year. So after George Floyd was killed last year, I was asked by one of our brilliant branches, our health branch in Oxfordshire, to go and take a knee with them to commemorate George Floyd, but also to protest racism. And they said, when we kneel down, what we're going to do is we're going to read out all the names of the UNISON members who've died, that we knew about at that time, who've died from COVID-19. It was a long list, and we were down on our knee for some time. But I'll tell you what also we noticed was how many of those names that were being read out were easily identifiable as African names, or easily identifiable as Asian names. And obviously my name isn't particularly, not at all easily recognizable as being of African descent. So there's probably so many more, and nobody has given us any answers. And at the same time, we're getting treated badly in many of these workplaces where our people are going in. So particularly private sector organisations who are telling our members, you will go into this care home, for example, you will sleep in at this care home, you will leave your family for this period of time, and you will do it, because if you don't, you will lose your job. And we're also hearing of many of our Black members being told, who have got these fears about taking the vaccine, understandable fears, being told if you don't take the vaccine, you're going to lose your job. Now, I'll be really clear. What we're saying to people is that we want as many people as possible, Black members, white members, to take this vaccine, because we think it keeps them safe, and we think it keeps the people you're providing the service to safe as well. But what seems to be happening is so many Black workers who are particularly being singled out because they have this fear about the vaccine. But I'll tell you what else is happening. It's about what is going to happen next. It's about the impact that we are about to see in terms of jobs. We have fought long and hard as Black people to get into many of these public service jobs. When I started and when I got into local government work in the early 1980s in a local authority in the Black country, there was hardly any Black people work for that local authority, hardly any. We fought long and hard to boost the numbers and to get career opportunities sorted for ourselves through our trade unions organising for us, which we had to bring many of those unions kicking and screaming to help support us. That's why we had self-organisation to help bring about some real change within workplaces. But now we're going to be faced with many of those jobs disappearing as this government cuts public spending. And we know what will happen, because it always happens unless we stand up against it, is that the people who will be picked off first is our Black workers. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what the hell's this got to do with institutional racism, Roger? Well, it's got everything to do with institutional racism. This stuff doesn't just appear. This stuff has been around for a long time, and I think we have to do much, much more. And why I raised the point at the beginning about hashtags, and it's because I'm seeing it too often now. It's too many people feel comfortable about their kind of contribution to anti-racism being sharing a hashtag on social media or saying I'm against racism. Well, you might be, but that doesn't help us. What we need is real action now, and we need the trade union movement to be standing up for Black workers and making sure that our voices can be heard within workplaces. And that's why I think it's important, why the TUC have instituted the TUC Task Force Against Racism to look at what we do as in organising, what we do and bargaining, what we do around public policy, and what we do as trade unions, as employers. These are important things, because I'm way past the time now where I think that it's acceptable for people in the trade union movement or people in political parties of any colour, frankly, to think that they can get away with doing nothing at this time. It is time that people stood up. It is time that people took action against the racism that, frankly, we've been talking about for years and years and years. And sometimes we see a few little steps forward, but far too often we see 3 steps back. I'll finish with this. We need to understand now that nobody ever gives us anything as working class people, and they have certainly never given Black working class people anything without us standing up and organising and fighting for it ourselves. And that's all what we have to do now. We need real change in society, real change that's going to bring about an opportunity for Black people to go into workplaces and make our contribution in the same way as everybody else. The trade union movement has to stand up and create the space for us to be able to do that. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to having the discussion with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. And I think really what we need to remember and take away from Roger's contribution is that it's right to be angry, you know, that it's not enough anymore to sit back and think, let this happen, particularly in the period that we're in with the rise of COVID and its impact, its disproportionate impact on Black and minority ethnic workers in the UK. It's time that we actually asked, why does that happen? So I think Roger's contribution in particular, talking about lack of trust and why communities have lack of trust and what it is that we all need to do to ensure that there is trust, that people actually can trust. It means, I think, as Roger was saying, we have to fight for real change and we have to make sure that we stand up and take action. So really, I'd like to thank Roger very much for his contribution. Obviously, there will be questions in the end and comment. So hopefully you get a chance again to come back in, Roger. And I'd like to now call our second speaker, who's Dr. Katie Bales. She is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Bristol. Her research focuses on irregular migration with a particular focus on work and welfare. She helped set up the Sanctuary Scholarship Programme at the University of Bristol and is a trustee of Bristol City of Sanctuary. She's co-editor of the Futures of Work blog, which provides space for radical critique of the world of work. Katie is going to speak in particular around issues of immigration and detention and looking at a hierarchy of immigration status and its impact on workers, not just those in the formal, but in the informal sector as well. So I'd like to call in Katie now.
Great, thank you, Sonia. I actually have a PowerPoint to share with everyone, so bear with me while I do that. Hopefully you can all see that now. When I was asked to give this talk, I wasn't quite sure where to begin because there's so many angles that you can come from when discussing these issues. But the primary argument that I want to make today is that law is central to creating and maintaining structures of precarity, which facilitates exploitation and racism at work. In particular, I'm going to be focusing on the situation of irregular migrants who often suffer from more extreme forms of exploitation. The UK law not only creates the category of irregular and regular work from which precarity arises, but it also denies undocumented workers labour rights and entitlements which offer protection. And I'm going to be drawing on 3 examples to illustrate this point. Firstly, the Immigration Act 2016, the doctrine of illegality, and the exclusion of immigration status as a protective characteristic under the Equality Act. I argue that all 3 of these legal frameworks intersect to create vulnerability to exploitation. The result is that undocumented migrants are pushed into work in the informal sector where racism and exploitation is more prevalent. But I also want to draw attention to the exploitation of irregular workers in the formalised work sector, primarily through the case study of labour and immigration detention. What this shows us is that whether work takes place in the informal, illegal sector or in legal workplaces that are approved by the state, undocumented migrants remain excluded from labour rights and protection because their work and value as human beings is not considered to be equal to that of our citizen labourers. So my critique begins with Section 34 of the Immigration Act 2016, which creates a criminal offence of illegal working where an individual is disqualified from work due to immigration status. The potential consequences for those found working without the right to work under the Act is imprisonment, a fine, or both. Despite intending to reduce the exploitation of irregular workers, the consequences of criminalising their work is that people get pushed further underground into grey areas of the economy where they're more likely to experience exploitation. Criminality under the Immigration Act also creates a lever with which exploitative employers can control workers and threaten to expose them. In addition to creating a criminal offence for workers, the Immigration Act also extends the criminal offence of employing irregular workers and increases the penalty for employers from 3 to 5 years imprisonment alongside a fine or both. But data from Corporate Watch suggests that the criminal offence under the Immigration Act is not used commonly, as immigration enforcement prefer to use civil penalties, which are easier to implement and quicker to administer because they don't have to access the courts. The civil penalty for employers employing those without the right to work is either a £15,000 or £20,000 fine per worker, depending on whether or not it's a repeat offence. Though this acts as a deterrent for unscrupulous employers, civil penalties can be reduced if the employer agrees to cooperate with Home Office officials. A £5,000 discount, for example, will be made where employers report suspected illegal workers, and a further £5,000 will be granted where there's evidence of active cooperation. We witnessed this in the example of Byron Burgers in 2016, when immigration enforcement raided a number of their branches throughout London, resulting in the arrest and detention of 35 Byron workers. What this tells us is that where employers cooperate with immigration enforcement, the criminal and civil repercussions for them are limited. However, no such leniency exists for the workers who are then subjected to detention and deportation. In such cases, full responsibility for the illegal working is transferred from the employer onto the worker. The Immigration Act therefore offers limited protection to irregular workers and instead codifies their vulnerability, which ultimately facilitates exploitation. Section 34 of the Immigration Act also creates an implied statutory prohibition, getting very legalistic here, on irregular work, which strengthens the doctrine of illegality. The concept behind the doctrine of illegality is that no man will profit from his own wrongdoing. So where work is seen as being illegal, the doctrine activates to block workers from making claims under their employment contract. The consequences for this are that irregular workers' contractual claims can be barred for reasons of illegality. This means they can't make claims for the national minimum wage, unpaid wages, unpaid holiday pay, or breaches of the working time regulations. Though the courts appear to have loosened the test for illegality in the case of Patel, the impact of Patel appears limited following the case of Okadina. In this case, it was suggested that where a statute such as the Immigration Act creates illegality, statutory construction should take precedence. So what is the purpose of the statute? So this is going to require the courts to ask, did Parliament intend to block these rights when they created the Act? Given the wider context of this Act and the fact that wages earned during irregular employment can be treated as proceeds of crime, the answer appears to be affirmative, that Parliament does seek to deny rights to this group of workers. As well as barriers in making claims in contract, irregular migrants also face hurdles in terms of making discrimination claims. In the case of ONU, it was held that immigration status doesn't fall under the protected characteristics of nationality or race, meaning that where discrimination arises as a result of immigration status alone, the victim in question cannot be compensated under the Act. This is highly problematic because, as outlined, the law itself creates precarity and vulnerability in terms of immigration status. As a result, immigration status is one of the reasons why irregular migrants are most likely to be exploited or abused. The idea that immigration status can be separated from the concepts of race and nationality is also highly problematic. Immigration status itself is not uniform. There are loads of different types of immigration status, but what's available to different individuals is largely determined from where they come from, which countries of origin they come from. Countries with economic instability, often as a result of colonial histories and intervention, are more likely to have harsh entry and immigration restrictions applied to them. Nationality is then central to the form of immigration status available to the individual and their ability to navigate the system. Race is also arguably influential here, as entrenched imperialist ideas about civilized and uncivilized states informs public policy on immigration and who is a desirable and undesirable migrant. The outcome of the above legal framework is that irregular migrants, who are often non-white individuals coming from formerly colonized states, are criminalized and left outside the borders of legal protection. What this tells us is that some people are more deserving of labor rights than others. When we map this onto who falls within the scope of protection, the issue of race and nationality becomes a clear dividing line. However, even where work is legitimized by the state and takes place within a lawful framework, irregular migrants remain exploited for their labor power and excluded from labor rights. And we see this in the case of labor within immigration detention, which I'm very briefly going to speak about now. Ironically, the only form of employment that irregular migrants can undertake legally is work within immigration detention centres, and this is known as paid work activities. This practice was implemented in 2006 by Tony Blair on grounds that it would help to prevent instances of boredom and frustration amongst detainees. But concerned that they'd be regarded as workers and thereby entitled to employment rights, the government excluded detainees from protection under the National Minimum Wage Act. This was justified on grounds that it would not be financially viable to provide detainees with the national minimum wage, and because a higher rate of pay would not reflect the true economic value of their labour. Accordingly, detainees are paid £1 an hour for routine work and £1.25 an hour for specific projects. Here we see that immigration status determines the value of work, as despite the fact that detainees perform the same jobs as their citizen counterparts, they're paid at a rate of 13% of the national minimum wage. In response to a Freedom of Information request, I learned that from January 2014 to July 2016, immigration detainees worked for a total of 1,955,584 hours in immigration detention centres throughout the UK. The entities profiting from this form of cheap and precarious labour are the private corporations running the detention centres, including GEO, Mighty, Serco and G4S. The majority of those detained are asylum seekers and refused asylum seekers, but a number of other status groups are also subject to detention. It's perhaps salient to note here that asylum seekers are generally people of colour coming from formerly colonised countries. During the period of July to September 2017, statistics show, for example, that the top asylum sending countries to the UK were Iran, Pakistan, Iraq, Bangladesh and Sudan, 4 of whom were directly colonised by the British. Though the liberal agenda legitimates much of this work on grounds that it is voluntarily agreed to, such an approach fails to capture the structural unfreedoms which underpin this labour. Detention practices are exploitative and problematic. In order to fully understand the nature of this exploitation, these practices must be located within a long historical narrative in which labour power has been expropriated from global South countries and colonial subjects. I argue that labour within immigration detention thus revives a colonial economy in which migrants seeking access to host states are regarded as less human and less deserving of the labour standards and freedoms afforded to state citizens. These conclusions are paralleled in the legal framework, including the Immigration Act and the common law doctrine of illegality, which deny irregular migrants' labour rights. The obvious solution here is that irregular work should be legalised and regulated alongside the provision of labour rights for workers. And I argue that ultimately, this is the only way to truly combat the labour exploitation of irregular migrant workers. And that's it from me. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Katie. I think Katie has raised some really interesting and important issues today. And it struck me while she was speaking is, of course, it's also in the framework of the more general attitude that we have or policies that there are in relation to prisoners. The fact that practically 2 million migrant worker hours are being donated to private companies free is part of a long pattern of using prisoners or people who are incarcerated to do work for private companies. So I'm sure that there will be many questions and discussion that will be raised at the last part of the at the last part of this session. So thank you very much, Katie. And I'd now like to move on to our next speaker, who's Yvette Williams. Yvette has an MBE, and she's also a leading member of the Justice for Grenfell campaign. And of course, all of you know that Grenfell was the terrible fire that took place in the Tower Block in London. And one of the things that Grenfell did expose was, again, the disparity of treatment and how Black and Asian people were both put in the tower, more likely to be in the tower, and in much more unsafe conditions. So Yvette has been involved in a number of successful campaigns. She was head of equality and diversity for the Crown Prosecution Service in London for 14 years, developing hate crime prosecution policies and community engagement strategies. And she was awarded an MBE, as I've already mentioned, in the New Year's Honours List in 2012. She's co-founder of the Justice for Grenfell campaign. The campaign has used a variety of media to ensure that the Grenfell Tower disaster remains in the public eye, and you'll know that it's been in the news at the moment. From the campaign's inception in June 2017, Yvette has been a key speaker at many events, including the Women of the World Festival, the Justice Lecture at the GMB Union Conference, and TEDx London. In October 2019, the Justice for Grenfell team won. Sorry, my computer has gone on me. Sorry. It's Justice for Grenfell team won the Significant Contribution Award as Woman of the Year. In April 2020, the campaign won the education category at the New York Film Festival for the film Grenfell and Social Murder, which was co-produced with the Open University and Hamlet Films. Yvette has written for and featured in a number of publications. And then I think this is a first for the Institute of Employment Rights. In September 2020, Yvette featured on an iconic front fold out cover of British Vogue as one of the 20 international activists, and also on the UK Ethnicity Awards top 100 list. So Yvette, all that I can say is I'm really honoured, and I'm sure we all are, that you have come to speak to us today, and I really look forward to your contribution, and I think we'll all be listening with great interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. It really is a pleasure to be here today. But it's also quite sad in terms of the topic that in, the 21st century, that we're sitting here talking about racism and its impact in Britain today. I said to somebody recently, I was doing a talk on racism in the workplace, and they went off on one, saying, never mind about racism in the workplace. Let's talk about racism in unemployment and how you're treated before you can even get a job. And it brought home to me that racism isn't just confined to the workplace, it's a continuum of our whole experience, and it can't be separated. But I thought about kind of discrimination and racism around unemployment. And we have known for years that, our communities feature in all of the worst statistics. And we can clearly see some state support around helping that discrimination to continue. So when you think of things like the Asylum and Immigration Act that has made employers kind of legally liable for checking the immigration status of their employees, the effect that that has really had is that employers don't want to take on Black applicants with too much work for them. And I think we see the worst effect of this as to what occurred with the Windrush scandal. People who came here as children, worked all their lives, escorted off their jobs, locked up as criminals, some of them deported. There's also that hostile environment also carries on around welfare benefits. And we know that many working people also have in-work benefits that they have to claim, and they're discriminated against in that process. And we see things that kind of impact them in a disproportionate way. We've had, the bedroom tax for, rented property, the limits on child benefit, being made to jump through hoops for, privatized medical tests if you have a disability, where a private company gets paid a packet of money to examine those and tell them that they need to go out and work and that they're unbelieved. This whole panoply of Tory offensive on kind of poor and vulnerable people does bear out disproportionately on Black people, but it also aids division, and it leaves them in a space where they're almost blamed for the situation that they're in. Another result of that is that, because they are in low paid, often casual, precarious employment, that the state feels that it has to subsidise. It's almost like an exploitation, a subsidised exploitation of Black communities. And no, it isn't just about race. It is also a class issue. It's systemic and disproportionate discrimination. But Black communities tend to get a worse deal. And there needs to be an understanding there. We're not seeking equality of discrimination and suffering. We're seeking a collective solution that benefits all. If our communities benefit, everyone benefits from that. And it's also important that we come together so that we don't play into the divisions that they inflict on us. So when we do get a job, it's really interesting because feedback from some people has been, when they start a new job in the 21st century, one of the first questions they're asked usually on their first day is, where are you from? And that's still happening. You move from unemployment where you're getting the dirty end of the stick into employment where you're being told you're already singled out at the beginning. So now we're in the midst of a pandemic where our people are dying at disproportionate rates. And in order for us to get through that, there is a massive threat to our job security and in turn, our families and our communities. So we've got those in employment have to deal with isolation, the choice of having to go to work or not, or protecting themselves, the lack of PPE equipment. And the government response to that at the beginning was almost made those things minimized as an issue, and they take a default position. So we had the highlighting of our socioeconomic conditions that they put us in, that we lived in overcrowding housing conditions that they put us in. We're more likely to be frontline workers, more likely to be in precarious employment, more likely to have zero contract hours. But we knew all these things before the pandemic arose. But by the government kind of housing it around those things, they make it seem as if it's some kind of lifestyle choice that we make. We used to have this saying when we were local. At the moment, we think that the government's got more front than the national. We haven't got a choice but to work. And where we work, we shouldn't be left unsafe. So women are particularly at a disadvantage in our communities. Their leave entitlements, like usually poor, and with childcare responsibility, homeschooling and that going on now, they're looking at their future and thinking, what is going to happen to my family? We've also got older workers. With the rise of the pension age, they're working longer. Many of them are working on the front line, especially those longer settled communities who, were invited to come to England to work in the very places like the NHS and on the transport system, having to work longer hours. In fact, at the beginning of the pandemic, many of them were called to come back to work, but offering no protection around them. And I really have to mention here the stuff that Marcus Rashford has done in having to coerce our government to feed children, and make the government making out that it's because we can't be bothered to feed our children, or we cannot budget our money, not recognising that poverty really exists both in work poverty and out of work poverty. And even that they can't get right. They end up sending children, you know, 2 mouldy potatoes and a bag of crisps. So the contempt that is shown for us is appalling. And now we think we're likely to see kind of increased workplace racism long term after the pandemic ends. We know from past experience that job insecurity, weak economy, increases kind of the divide and rule, and in turn increases racism for our communities. I know Roger's already touched on the, you know, the large debate around why we won't take the vaccine. But what we really need to be careful of is if that is changed into whether it's a choice, or if it may become an excuse in the future to not employ Black workers because they haven't taken the vaccine. And I think we need to keep a special eye on that. Going on in the workplace, one of the other things that is really being spoken about in our communities is the trend to put Black and brown faces in positions to talk on our behalf and support the Tory rhetoric. It's something that we call like the racial gatekeepers and enablers who collude with them and promote that they're looking at the problem with some sort of humanity, rather than really addressing the systemic racism that's going on. I don't want to call any names. There are a few in the current cabinet, but I'm happy to name them in private conversation. This really is putting our communities in further danger. Following the horrific murder of George Floyd, a lot of employers wanted to be seen to be doing something. And one of the feedbacks I got was that all of a sudden, Black staff in workplaces were asked to do the race job as an add-on to their unpaid role. So it was recognised, their lived experience, but it's abused at the same time. So they were asked to organise like Black History Month events, etc. They felt unable to say no, but at the time feeling undervalued. And we need to look at some of the things that are valued in the workplace, just generally. So community languages are often given no value, but they should be a paid valuable source in workplaces. I'm going to touch on the ethnicity pay gap, and we should all be supporting that. It's not a time for further reviews, audits. You know, there's enough of those already filed. We just need action. They needs to be implemented. All employers should be able to respond to that and produce their figures at the end of the year. And there needs to be some sanctions put in place for those that don't deliver, or those that cannot answer the question as to why they don't have a diverse workforce. There's a saying, you know, if it's not measured, then it doesn't get done. And I think we really need to stop talking about this, stop reviewing, stop investigating, and just get on with it. I'm going to touch on Grenfell briefly, because we know that the inquiry refused to even have race and discuss race as part of its terms of reference. And when we look at, you know, the whole deregulation, exploitation by private companies around Grenfell, one of the voices that are actually missing from that very inquiry are the workers themselves, the workers that worked on the building. So again, you know, a marginalized voice, you know, what was happening with those workers we know they're likely to be in precarious employment. So, and then also, you know, the inquiry's immediate attack on the firefighters and scapegoating those. I'm going to wrap up. But one of the things, I hope everybody saw this recently, was the Steve McQueen production, Small Axe, where they looked at the story of the mangrove. And I worked for the mangrove for many years. And there's a slot in it where Althea LeConte-Jones, although she's, and this is going back to 1970, although she's a member of the Black Panthers, she's utilised by the unions to go in to one of the factories to get a group of Sikh workers to join the union. She tells them that joining a union is crucial to their working life. And it made me wonder why that isn't kind of continuing today. And I think trade unionism is really part of the solution. It needs to be fully engaged with our communities. People go home from work and they share their experiences of what's happening to them. But key to it, I think, for me, is racism isn't a Black issue. It's a people's issue. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in big institutions. And even something like the BBC is appalling, the millions that they spend in payoffs and settlements to cover up racism rather than address it as a national scandal. And if it's operating in big institutions like that, God only knows what's happening in the small, greedy, for-profit private companies. So what I wanted to end with was division kind of makes us weak, unity makes us strong. We need a society that prioritizes everybody's quality of life. And if we don't really learn from what's happening from the current pandemic, then we never will. So I'm going to end there.
Thank you very much, Yvette. And I hope we will learn, because the lessons that we have to learn that you've, I mean, so well described, going right back to mangrove, going right through into Grenfell, you know, we really must not forget. And I think it's very important that you've particularly looked at the impact of poverty and race and class, and the important argument that everybody benefits if we can actually live in a society where divisions are not fostered and encouraged. So I really like to thank you for your contribution. Again, we'll have questions at the end. I'm sure there will be. And then can I move on to our last speaker of the day, who's Asad Rehman. Asad is the executive director of the radical anti-poverty and social justice charity War on Want, that works to achieve a vision of a just world through a mission to fight against the root causes of poverty, inequality, human rights violations, all of the issues that have come up in the speeches today. Asad is a leading climate justice activist whose work has helped to reframe the climate crisis as a crisis of neoliberal capitalism, inequality, and racism. Over the last 35 years, he's worked with many social movements, both globally and nationally, including in the anti-racist movement, the alter-globalization movement, and the anti-war movement. So Asad is going to speak today specifically around the issues of race, class, and the super-exploitation of migrant workers. Well, you're very welcome, Asad.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you to IER for the very, very kind invitation to join you today and to be on panel with so many great comrades. Actually, if you don't know War on Want is the Labour Movement's charity. It was founded by the Labour Movement and continues to be rooted in the Labour Movement. And we work and support social movements and trade unions all around the world and engage in campaigns and standing with workers' rights here in the UK as well. I mean, listening to both Yvette and Katie and Roger, it just reminded me of when I was a child growing up and remembering the struggles of my father in the knitting factories in Lancashire about the super exploitation of migrant workers that took place, the precarity in which they existed, the exploitation of wages between them and other workers, and of course the practices that were put in place in terms of affecting Black workers with unemployment and with job losses first and foremost. And that struggle and the centrality that my father and my community put in workers' rights and in the trade union movement as the place in which to realize their rights, and the importance that the trade union and labor movement has had throughout Black communities and their organizing. And Yvette absolutely touched on it. You know, when you look not just at Mangrove, but so many, we understood that our fight was not just on about fighting racism in the streets, but it was about fighting in the workplace, and recognize that our collective power came through organizing, and it came through organizing in our communities. And of course, it came through organizing within our workplaces and in the labor movement. And I sort of just wanted to just, you know, touch on some of those hierarchies that we've seen created in the labor market. You know, obviously lots of us have talked for a long time, and Katie touched on it also, about, you know, the power imbalances that are created through precarious contracts. You know, we now have, you know, and I'm sure this number is now even greater, you know, we have about 4.6 million workers on precarious contract. You know, about 15% of the workers who routinely suffer from managers controlling their alterations to their work schedules. And, you know, and it just reminds me of that myth that's just been created, you know, that flexibility is demanded of workers because this is just the reality of modernity, that to be competitive in this modern world and with modern production requires workers to somehow respond to that. And we see it, and of course that spread is not just in what was traditionally called the low pay or the informal sectors. We see it now in education, we see it in care work, we see it in elsewhere, this spread of this idea of precariousness and precarious contracts. And it's quite stunning, isn't it, that we can have a situation where, you know, we have these modern logistic chains which are capable of like incredibly detailed workplace planning, but they can't show a predictability of work hours. And reality, and that's done deliberately, I would argue, because it draws on something that is, of course, historic, which is about giving greater power to employers and bosses over their workers. And in reality, it continues that same old tradition that there is absolutely nothing modern about exploitation. We're fighting an historic battle time and time again. And it's that power that we can really see, and it's brought, of course, very starkly in front of center during the COVID pandemic. You know, I live in Newham. You know, we have had in the first wave the highest mortality rate of anywhere in the country, because overwhelmingly we are a Black diverse community. But you go to the train stations and the buses each and every day, and it's still packed. Why? Because the majority of Black people in my borough are locked into precarious work, are locked into frontline work, which requires them to be able to go out. And of course, as Yvette said, all of the multi-dimensional poverty that exists, of multi-generational families living in poor housing, with little or no protection, all of these things, of course, brought really front and center the question, without hours, how will I eat? How will I pay my rent? And, you know, and that connection between the fight in the workplace and the fight actually around our benefit system, which through the threat of sanctions forces people to sign on to agency work, or your benefits are going to be taken away. You know, the precariousness relies on no social safety net. And of course, you know, that has been rolled out first and foremost with migrant workers, right? You have no access to the social safety net. And so we're talking about what, 20% of the workforce, you know, deliberately put in a situation where they're left with without any ability to be able to access that. And that, again, has been brought into sharp relief during COVID, when we know that people are making decisions about not isolating because of what it means in terms of the impact on their wages, and what it means in terms of their reality of their family. They don't have the wealth, the capital wealth within their within their families to make decisions about isolating or taking sick or thing. And we see that imbalance now played out, and we saw it clearly with the amazing Unite campaign around around Sports Direct. We've seen it, of course, in the great campaign being run by the Bakers Union, and we were proud that we're supporting that in terms around the McStrikers, where you see the bullying and harassment and are forcing, particularly migrant workers, both, and this is where I think the racial and gender aspect also to come in to work in unsafe environments, to deny them the critical PPE equipment. And we know that Black workers and migrant workers are 3 times more likely to be on these precarious contracts. And so, what it does also is, of course, it creates not just about your workplace in terms of the precarity about your salary, but it makes you less able to challenge the bullying and abuse, because it hands more power to the bosses. It makes you less able to push for better wages. We know that, if you're on a 0-hour contract, you're materially something like between 7 and 10% less or better off than people who are doing the same job on better contracts. And the more that precarious contracts are rolled out through, at first attacking migrant workers, they're a threat to all workers. And so we see this creation, as Katie pointed out, this hierarchy of contracts with different employment rights, right? Employees, workers, self-employed. And then we have the parallel situation with a hierarchy of around based on your immigration status of the citizen, the settled status, the temporary visa, the undocumented. And, and so much of that, of course, is also linked to the deliberate sort of fragmentation of work. We saw that as being the logic behind the outsourcing. So you could erode rights around sick pay and social and holiday and pensions. And of course, what it ends up doing is creating this racialized and gendered hierarchy in the workplace. And the right has always seek to be able to do this, both in our workplace and in our societies. First, of course, through the logic as a result of the failed neoliberal economic project. And then, of course, in the last decade as a result of austerity. And when we can see at this moment, it's a really critical question for us, because you look at both in the UK and globally with the rising unemployment, with the millions of jobs that are at risk. The ITUC and the ILO talk about, something like 400 million jobs are at risk globally. And we can already see what the response from the corporate elites are. They talk about that to build the foundations for this economic recovery, we need more deregulation of the labor market. We need more policies around fire and rehire. We need more precarity. And of course, it's most brutal in the global south, but the reality, as we know, we're seeing it also occurring in the workplace here. And that's why I think, for the trade union movement, the fight around workers' rights and tackling, the super exploitation can't be simply about the workplace. It also has to be linked to tackling the hostile environment, because that's where, so much of this super hierarchy is created. So how do we do that? Well, and I wanted to just spend the last couple of minutes just talking about that. I think we have to refight that universality of workers' rights, right? That these are workers' rights, irrespective of your immigration status, irrespective of your race or your gender. And it might be seen like, of course that's right, that's glib and blah, but it's an important fight to constantly refight, because of the way that the system creates these hierarchies. And I think we've got to approach workers' rights, of course, in an intersectional way. We can't simply see workers' rights in abstract, away from the fight around racism and sexism or for migrant justice. And we've got to see the fight not just being in the workplace, because the question now is, what is the workplace for so many workers, right? So we have to be thinking about how do we fight for workers' rights that go beyond that, and that also link to social protection and welfare benefits, particularly at this time when so much of the labour movement's attention is going to be on how do we protect what we have. And the more that people lose their jobs, the less those will be included in the broader labour movement struggle. So, there is of course, many wider issues we can see that the labour movement needs to intervene in. And Yvette outlined some of those, particularly how immigration and border controls have come into the workplace. You know, Roger has fought long and hard about the fact that, you know, we've got UNISON's members of UNISON, we've got nurses and doctors being asked to become immigration workers in the NHS. We've got private landlords now checking on the status of tenants. It's why in Newham we have migrant workers, you know, paying £10 a night and sleeping in basements because they're undocumented workers, right? And fall outside. And so reminding even the labour movement that an injury to one is an injury to all is such an important concept for us to rebuild towards. That actually, you know, fighting immigration enforcement is important because whilst it places controls on some workers, of course, its impact is to have a race to the bottom and retelling the stories of why, I've just lived down the road from Bow where the Match Girl strike, took place, the foundational moment of the trade union movement. And we've got to remember those were primarily Irish workers, right? And they were women of migrant workers. And they ran a campaign that brought migrant and non-migrant workers campaigns together against that exploitation. It's been repeated again and again. It was repeated in Grunwick. It was repeated in Imperial Typewriter strike. It's been repeated again where migrant workers' fights have actually been about tackling the exploitation of all workers. And it's been about raising the bar, not lowering the bar. And that has got to be the labour movement history. We've got to remind people that labour movement history is the history of migrants organising. And, I always say the slogan on all of our trade union banners is the workers of the world unite. And that I think is also really important in this conversation, because as we see globalization, as we see supply chains, we see that there is no one single workplace. But there are really important developments. I think the amazing work that's been done, for Fight for 15 in the US, the Poor People's Campaign, which talks about organizing, not just in the workplace, in the community, provide really valuable lessons about how we can come together. The Amazon campaign that was just run recently is again a really important way of us trying to connect workers in the UK and migrant workers everywhere. We see the reality in, of course, the COVID vaccine, and we talk about now a COVID apartheid that's been rolled out. And of course, and if you haven't taken action today, please take action. The UK at the WTO today is blocking lifting of a waiver of the waiver which would allow countries of the global south access to the vaccine. And we have this horrific situation where a cost of a vaccine in the EU is $2.50, and yet in Uganda the people are being charged $7. The government is being charged, and the workers in the global south are not going to have access to this vaccine till 2024. Why? Of course, because it's power of corporations, because this could have been lifted. We could have been talking about a people's vaccine, but we're also, I think, creating an apartheid in the workplace as well. I mean, I hear often, people talking about, well, one of the results of this COVID is going to be, we're going to have this hybrid working. Lots of us will be able to work from home when we want, and there'll be limited work in the workplace. That might be true for a section of the workforce, but for frontline workers, including and increasingly the precarious workers, they will always be out on the front line. They will always be in the unsafe workplaces. And the importance, therefore, of not allowing this stratification of the labour, of the trade union movement, of workers is really, really important. And the importance of having a really holistic fight around the kind of economy we want, the kind of workers' rights that we want, and really bringing that intersectional approach to this fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asad. I think as our final contribution, you've really kind of brought all of the previous discussions together, looking at the hostile environment in which workers have to work, looking at precariousness and the growth of precariousness, and then that theme really that you ended up on, the importance of universality, that all of us benefit from rights for all. We're now going to go to the last section of today's meeting, which is the question and answer session. We've got quite a few questions coming in. Hopefully we can get to them all. I'll read out each of the questions in turn and then see if which of our speakers would best be placed to answer it. The first question we have is, how do you prove you're a victim of racism at the workplace where the discrimination isn't so obvious? How do we expose poor practice or treatment? And the person who's made the question said, I often deal with members who just know that they're a victim of racial discrimination, but have very poor evidence of that, no witnesses, etc. So that's a question from Johanna. I don't know if this is something that Roger would want to deal with.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Obviously, there's what you need to do through your union to prove discrimination and getting appropriate support. Actually links to another point that was made by Joe Rust later on about in UNISON we have a race protocol, and because quite often what happens is that we get advice back from, I guess this happens to all unions, you get advice back from your union's solicitors which say there's not reasonable prospects of success in a particular case. And quite often what happens then is that the case is just dropped, even when there's some big issues that could come out of those cases. And the whole process of the protocol, certainly in UNISON, is for us to take another look at that and to take a view about whether or not there are bigger issues involved in looking at a particular case. So there's the kind of formal things that we can do through the structures. But I have to say, one of the things that I think we often forget in the trade union movement is that, yes, we have to deal with individual cases and make sure that people's cases are dealt with properly and fairly and properly looked at, which isn't always the case. I know that as a black worker myself who's gone through all of that. But sometimes we forget that we can deal with some of these things collectively. Not everything has to be done individually. We can organise on a collective basis to raise issues about some of these things that employers are doing, which might impact on one worker, but also will impact on other workers. And sometimes we don't join those things up. So I think there's the formal individual dealing with a case stuff that we are kind of used to doing within the trade union movement. But far too often, I think we neglect collectivizing these issues. So for me, that's kind of part of the answer to the question that's been raised. Let's try and see where we can collectivize the issues within a workplace, but also sometimes some of these issues need collectivizing outside of the workplace as well. We need to bring in the community to raise their voices about the things that are happening in well, certainly in public services. You know, these are issues that they're paying for. You know, people are paying for public services. They are paying people's wages to take crap decisions sometimes, and we have to hold those people to account.
Thank you very much, Roger. We've got a second, not such a question, but an announcement. Bruno de Florence has just asked us to announce, just if you saw it in the news, that the new WTO chief is a Black African woman. And so it shows that, you know, that there are new voices taking the center stage, and it's important for us to build on these rather than to ignore them. The next question is from Karen, who had a question for Katie. And the question is, what impact do you think the post-Brexit points-based immigration system will have for EU workers in terms of precarity and vulnerability to exploitation?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to bring EU nationals into the same sphere that third country nationals have been in for a long time. And the same sort of class discrimination is going to be at play here. So you've got the salary thresholds, the fact that we're not going to open a low skilled worker route. So already we're kind of stating that, you know, you can only come to this country to work if you're either highly educated or you have a lot of wealth behind you. And I think that sort of says a lot about the type of people that we want to be allowing into the country. I think that it will push people again into sort of entering undocumented and coming in through an irregular form, like those routes already exist. And I think particularly from certain countries in Europe that perhaps don't have as strong an economy as the UK, you know, people will just find informal routes of entry. So I guess the discussion that I had earlier in terms of those legal exclusions that people who are irregular and undocumented suffer from will now be extended to EU citizens from lower income countries. And, you know, again, I think it's highly problematic. I don't really understand why we're not opening the lower skilled work route. I mean, it's quite obvious now that it's necessary. And yeah, I mean, I think it is highly problematic. And I think, again, that issue of right to work checks, who can work, will start extending further, people with different accents, and we'll find more levels of discrimination. So yeah, I think it's going to be problematic, and I think EU citizens will suffer. But to be honest, third country national citizens, I mean, and even UK citizens who might have a different name, or as Yvette said, different, you know, who are non-white, are already being discriminated against and included within this hostile environment. So now all we're seeing is the extension of that.
Thank you very much, Katie. We go on to the next question, which is from Suzanne, who says, the talks are very informative. Thank you, Suzanne, and thanks to the speakers. But what action are we being asked to take on an individual or branch level? Bringing it down, what specific changes can we affect? I mean, I think this is something all of the speakers really have a lot of experience of activism. So who would like to answer the question or to contribute to the discussion?
I mean, in terms of what we're asking people to do, I think there's a number of different levels. One of the levels is to actually make sure that we're taking this issue of racism seriously, because it's not always been the case, frankly, where many of us as Black workers have felt that workplace organisations, and whether trade unions or employers, have treated seriously the issues that we've been talking about for some considerable time. You know, I remember many years ago when I worked for a local council in God's own country, the West Midlands, and I remember I was complaining of the treatment that Black workers were receiving in the workplace. We didn't call it institutional racism in those days because the term wasn't really around. We just called it racism in the workplace, basically. Now, I got threatened with the sack, I remember, by a particular manager. Then years later, after Stephen Lawrence had been killed and the inquiry report came out, I saw an employer on the telly, on a news thing. I saw this guy get up and he's saying, my organisation is institutionally racist and we're going to do something about it. We're going to set up a task force and we're going to have working groups and we're going to produce a report and we're going to have the film of the report. I don't know. I mean, it just went on, this guy. And I noticed that this was the guy who threatened to sack me all those years ago. So I tried to contact him and he didn't. To this day, I've never had a reply to my message to this person, although I do know it was opened, my message. But it's how organisations treat this issue seriously, and how, for us, racism isn't a fashion that you can jump in and out of, where you can be saying things like, we need to turn this moment into a movement, which I hear all the bloody time at the minute, or you know, all I need to do is share my hashtag, you know, and that's all people talk about. We need real change within workplaces, and no two workplaces are the same. So you need to make sure that you're listening to what Black workers are saying within the workplace, but also, if you are a white person, that you are the one who are having conversations with your white colleagues about the issues of racism, because you have to own this as well as white workers. This is not just something that we as Black workers have to sort out, right? It's something that white workers have to engage with and talk to your colleagues about as well. We'll organise, we'll make our voices heard as Black workers, we always do, right? But white workers have to take a positive role in this as well. Hope that answers your question a little bit.
Thank you, Roger. We're now on to our last question, and it's from Carol, who would like to know if any of the panelists can comment on strategies to counter institutional racism in the workplace, or on the failure of the Equality Act 2010 to counter racism in the workplace. And again, this is a question for any of the panelists, but I wondered in particular if Yvette and Asad, who come from different experiences of countering institutional racism, whether you've any particular insights that you think would be translatable well into the workplace.
I mean, I think the watering down of the Equality Act has been absolutely appalling. We had the 2001 Act that came in straight after the Lawrence inquiry, that was very tight and very innovative. Quickly that was watered down. I mean, even the public's, the statutory duty on equality is poor. And also as well, we need to see what went on in the meantime. So in the meantime, while that was happening, they got rid of like the Commission for Racial Equality, housed it under a Human Rights Commission, where race became kind of pushed further down the scale. It had been seen as it was dealt with. I was thinking this from the previous question. So I think, Black workers need to lead. They're the ones that experience it. However, we're over reviewed, we're over audited, and actually we need to be saying to white employers what they understand by being anti-racist, because I'm not always sure they're clear on what that means, because by saying you're anti-racist, bring some responsibility to yourself on how systemic and institutional racism works. And if you cannot explain that, then actually you shouldn't be giving yourself that label. I think in terms of, there are some quick wins that can happen in the employment place. When I was in the civil service, we used to have a problem in terms of the amount of Black staff that were promoted. And I suggested one year, maybe they should tie their bonuses, which they all loved, to promoting a Black person on their team for the year. And they laughed at it. But I was just thinking, if it was tied to their pay, they wouldn't have a problem. If you had to recruit 2 Black staff to your team in a year, they would go out on the street and soon do it.
They'd soon do it. Damn right. They'd soon do it.
So there's that's why I said about putting in sanctions. It's important to put in sanctions and to have something measured, and why, and to make people buy into that, even if they don't understand. If you hit them in their pocket or their jobs become kind of a bit tentative, they will act. So stop looking at us, start researching yourselves in terms of why racism is still perpetuated. And I think that's a quick turnaround.
Thank you very much, Yvette. Are there any other the panelists who want to come in? If not, I think now we can sum up and move to the end of the meeting. Anyone else got anything burning that they want to say?
Sonia, I can briefly. I mean, it's interesting to just remind you about the Macpherson inquiry. As somebody who was involved in that campaign, in the Lawrence campaign, in the fight around the Macpherson inquiry, I think there's sometimes people forget some of the most important lessons. That fight about institutional racism wasn't an abstract legal fight. It came from organizing of workers and communities decades long, and its realization was to see it in the inquiry as just a place of contestation, and to have something that was recognized that was our lived experience. But the key question always was not about, can you just win an institutional recognition of this term, but do we have the power to be able to then ensure that is implemented and the state is held accountable. And to me, that is fundamentally the key question we should always come back to, which is, how do we build our power because, the question about, what do you do about this in the workplace is fundamentally always about what is the balance of power between in the workplace and what is the balance of power for Black workers or migrant workers within that. And we're in this moment that we're going to have a profound conversation, right, about what is the economy going to look like after COVID, and it's going to be part of a much bigger conversation that's taking place globally. We have all these mantras, right? Boris Johnson talks about it, Biden talks about it, we're going to build back better, but build back better for who? And build back better for what? So it's important that we're part of that conversation. So when we as members of unions, I think it's an important part that we should be pushing in our workplaces to say, how is the labour movement going to be part of this conversation? What are the principles in which we're going to fight? What kind of workers' rights are we going to start talking about? How are we reimagining the economy? There's a very famous quote from Milton Friedman who says, real change, comes in a moment of crisis, right? And it's about the ideas that lie around. And, this is, I think, we've been on a retreat for a long time. This is a moment, I think, for us to be able to actually start to fight for a positive fight. What does actually anti-racism in workers' rights really look like? These are the frameworks and the principles, and this is the institutions we need to be able to hold that to make sure that we deliver them. So I think there is no one silver bullet, but there's a lot for us to be able to draw upon. And I think it was Roger that mentioned, when we come out of this COVID, there's going to be a possible, sort of two pathways. Are we going to see a new wave of austerity, a new wave of public sector cuts, which are going to, of course, disproportionately affect Black and migrant workers? Or are we going to see, a different kind of economy where we're going to be investing in, all the things that we've recognized are important during COVID, our communities, our safety at workplace, ensuring, jobs are protected. So in that conversation, we have to be asking which jobs will be protected, how will they be protected? And that, I think, is part of, this moment we're in, and why these two webinars are so important, because I think, they're not about simply saying, here's the toolkit, do this and everything will be all right. It's actually about saying, only if we're engaged in this conversation do we change the dynamics and the frame of this conversation. We have to look to the past, but we also have to look to the present, but also imagine what kind of future we want and bring those. And this is the moment where we fight the issues about the hostile environment, about the segregation of the workplace, of really moving the labour movement from a passive position about anti-racism to an active position about anti-racism forces.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much, Asad. And I was going to say I couldn't have said it better myself. I couldn't actually. So many of the points that you raised were the ones that I wanted us to go away with. The idea that it's important what we do. It's important to look back to the past, but it's also important to imagine what kind of future do we want. And I think so many of the speakers today have talked about a future that we want. We want a future where poverty doesn't determine issues about who has access to healthcare and who doesn't, where benefits are for all of us, not for the few. We want a society really that moves away from what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years. So I hope that everyone will go away from this meeting today, which I think has been a great meeting, actually thinking, what can I do about this? What is my role? And so if you've liked this Zoom, I'd like you to sign up for the weekly IER newsletter. It's at www.ier.org.uk, and you can get the latest employment rights information straight into your inbox, including advance notice of all our webinars. So I hope you'll think of coming to ones in the future. Note that there's further reading resources at the end of the last slide, so you can take home some homework and do some homework. For all subscribers to the Employment Rights Bulletin publications, our next one will be arriving at your doormats in a number of days, and it's, of course, the very important and topical HSE and COVID at Work, a case of regulatory failure, and it'll be launched in the coming weeks. And to non-IT subscribers, it will be available to purchase as a hard copy or digital download from our online shop after lunch. The order form will be posted in the chat if you want to take up advance orders of any copies. And it seems to me that this COVID is going to be the issue of the workplace for many, many months to come. And it's a tool that will be very useful for all of you. And then finally, to make sure that you register for the upcoming expert webinar on redundancy and COVID. Are our redundancy laws strong enough? And that's on Thursday, the 25th of February at 10 a.m. If you're joining us on Zoom, then when the meeting's finished, it should send you straight to a 30-second survey about how we did. Could you fill it in, as it helps with our continued improvement? So I'd like to say goodbye to all of you. It's been a session that I've really not only enjoyed, but learned from, and I hope that everybody else will go away feeling the same. Thank you to all of our speakers, to Roger, to Yvette, to Katie and Asad, and thanks to the IR people in the background who've been making sure this is possible. Thank you. Goodbye.